Thank you, Serge, and merci beaucoup. I'm Kate Logan, so I'm Associate Director of Climate at the Asia Society Policy Institute, based out of Washington, D.C., and we also have a contingent based in New York as well. So I'd like to start just by sharing a bit of quick background about the context of today's event. And I should mention as well that apart from those of you who are here on site, we'll also be recording the discussion. So we'll be able to share it far and wide with Asia Society's vast global network. So I'm really glad that we'll be able to do that as well. And then I'll introduce our two speakers and then dive in. So as was mentioned, today's event is an official affiliated event with the Summit for a New Global Financing Pact. And as many of you who brave the traffic might be aware, there are as many as, I think, 55 was the last number I heard, heads of state or heads of government in town for the summit, both from developed and developing countries for this initiative that's been spearheaded by French President Emmanuel Macron, which is really a critical opportunity to make real progress toward reforming the global financial architecture to better address the multiple ongoing concurrent crises our world is facing, including the debt crisis, the cost of living crisis, but also, importantly, from the perspective that we'll be adding, the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and all of these different perspectives together at the same time. So a successful summit will move toward a system that provides the finance to address these crises concurrently, so that we can reach our targets based on the Paris Agreement to limit global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade on time, but also enable populations globally to thrive and prosper through this transition. And that's where we come in as the Asia Society with the perspective that we bring. It's really critical that Asia does not get left behind in these discussions. Asia's accounts for over half the global population, many of whom are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. But at the same time, as many of you in the room are likely well aware, Asia's portion of global emissions is continuing to rise, already accounts for over half of global annual emissions. Obviously, historically, that's quite different, but that share is continuing to increase, in part because there are a number of major emerging economies that are still working to figure out how to peak their emissions and bring them down as well. So today's event also leverages the background research of one of our initiatives, the High-Level Policy Commission on Getting Asia to Net Zero. I'm really grateful to have Vivek Pathak here today, who's a member of that commission. The commission was launched last May 2022 under the leadership of the former Asia Society president, the Honorable Kevin Rudd, and includes leaders like former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and former president of the Marshall Islands, Hilda Heine, among others. And the Commission's first 3 products in the past year have focused on building the case that greater climate action and ambition is beneficial for Asia's economy and societal development. But of course, that requires unblocking certain challenges, in particular the finance, because vast amounts of investment will be needed to make that happen. So building this case that climate action is beneficial from an economic and societal perspective. So against this backdrop, I'd like to quickly introduce today's speakers, and then we'll dive into the discussion. And we do hope that all of you will be leaving today with a better understanding of how this week's summit could help assemble the finance needed to help Asia achieve both climate goals and development goals at the same time. So first, to my left is Vivek Pathak. He serves as the Global Head and Director of Climate Business at the International Finance Corporation, and as mentioned, is a member of the High-Level Policy Commission on Getting Asia to Net Zero. In his role at IFC, he looks for opportunities and works to mobilize capital needed to move them forward, in particular around the private sector, which will be key to greening major sectors of national economies globally, from energy and transport to agricultural and manufacturing. And then to Vivek's left, we have Emmanuel Guérin. I'm not sure if I got that pronunciation right, please forgive me. Who is a fellow at the European Climate Foundation, specializing in the geopolitics of climate, including climate security. He's also a former executive director for international affairs at ECF. But prior to that, he has a deep background working for the French government in the Foreign Affairs Ministry, most notably as a senior advisor to Laurence Toubiana, France's former climate change ambassador. And Emmanuel was one of the key minds behind the structure of the Paris Agreement back in 2015. So I'm really glad to have both of the perspectives, and especially to be bridging the perspectives between France as the convener of this summit and what this means globally, as well as the Asian perspective as well. So with that, welcome to both Vivek and Emmanuel, and I think we'll dive right in. And I should add at the end, we will leave a few minutes for audience question and answer, so please feel free to be thinking of anything else that you'd like to ask at the end of the discussion as well. So I'd like to start from a pretty broad perspective, and maybe we can start with Emmanuel, sort of from the broader global perspective, and then go to Vivek after that. This idea that the summit is really aiming to overhaul the global financial architecture to simultaneously address multiple challenges. But in this context, would love to hear your high-level thoughts on sort of what are Asia's unique challenges and opportunities in the context of the summit. So in other words, how does Asia fit into the context of this summit?
Brilliant. Well, thanks, Kate, for the invitation, and very happy that we're having this conversation together. I'll make 4 quick points to kick off the conversation with you all. First, indeed, very briefly, at least my reading of the things to watch in particular at the Finance Summit that President Macron is convening here in Paris tomorrow and the day after. Second, to point a bit more specifically, and this is where indeed it's going to start becoming Asia-specific on the financing of loss and damage. Third, I'd like to say a few words about just energy transition partnerships, in particular in Indonesia, but also coming up in Vietnam and India and a few other places. And I'd like to say a few words in closing about the securitization of trade and clean energy technology value chains and the opportunities I think it creates for many countries in the region beyond China. So to start briefly on the summit, I mean, the objectives are quite broad and general, but given the audience here, wanted to stress 3 things in particular. The first is that there was really a conscious, dedicated and thorough effort in working with the Chinese government so that hopefully significant progress is made in coordinating debt restructuring and debt cancellation in between China and the members of the Paris Club on that. You know that it's been a live issue for a while, with some pieces of good news here and there along the way, but that remains a massive, if not the first obstacle in unlocking the finance that is necessary for the climate transition in many countries around the world, including in Asia. Second, I think something to watch at the summit is going to be quite specifically the discussion on possibly putting a levy on fossil fuels, maybe in the maritime sector, at least that is the option that has the most momentum at the moment, even if, of course, that's by far not a done deal. There is also aviation as an option. If that were to be on maritime, that's very much something to be looked at in the context of the International Maritime Organization as well, and the effort from the shipping industry to decarbonize itself and generate revenue for those investments, but also, at least that is very much the line that is being pushed by a few countries, including here at this summit, to leverage money to pay for loss and damage induced by climate change. So, well, that's obviously another very important topic. The third one is, I think, more loosely related to the reform of the international financial institutions more generally, the Bretton Woods system, or what's left of it. And this is the part of the agenda that is also very much championed by the Prime Minister from Barbados, Maya Mottley, and includes a number of very specific and important reforms, both to the World Bank and to the International Monetary Fund, that maybe we could discuss in the conversation later on. But that's basically it for what is coming up in the next few days. Very much keeping in mind that one of the most important objectives of the summit is to bridge the differences in between the global north and the global south that are present at the moment. I think there is no point in denying them. But the attendance for the summit is a very good sign, I think. I mean, it's a bit weak in terms of participation of leaders from the G7 countries beyond France and Germany. But it's an impressive lineup of top political leaders from the global south, and both the large middle-income countries and some very important vulnerable and developing countries. More briefly on the other three specific points. As I said, on the financing for loss and damage, which is, I appreciate, a very important topic for many countries in the region, and I'll not name them all. As I said, there is the opportunity that the summit is creating to have a bit of further political momentum injecting into putting a levy on maritime emissions. There is also quite simply the fact that the COP at the end of the year happens in the United Arab Emirates, of all places. And therefore that it creates an obvious link in between the source of the problem and paying for the consequences of the problem. And so I think we should also expect that the very basic idea of the polluters pay principle applied to our topic means in some form putting a tax on fossil fuels or fossil fuel emissions. Indeed, that's the debate at the moment, to leverage money for loss and damage. On just energy transition partnerships, which, as some of you will know, was announced in Indonesia by the time of the previous G20, is very much also a discussion in India and Vietnam, and hopefully other countries in the region soon, because it needs to multiply and not just be a series of bilateral deals. But the simple message that I wanted to convey is, let's not take for granted what was agreed to on paper, because it's not the same thing as the success of the energy transition. And I think the example in South Africa, which was the first of those just energy transition partnerships, is here to remind us that things can go wrong in many different ways, but indeed at the moment there are, for the most part, only 6 hours of electricity generated in South Africa, so it's a major political crisis. We all know that Eskom was a bankrupt utility way before the Just Energy Transition Partnership, but I'm struck discussing with colleagues attending the summit from the BRICS group of countries, Brazil and indeed South Africa and India and certainly China as well, that there is a little music that what's happening in South Africa is the proof that just energy transition partnerships don't work, and that the energy transition doesn't work, and that this is putting an extra stress on already very weak power generation systems. So just want to say to everybody, let's continue to stay close in Indonesia and Vietnam and India to make sure that all of those deals go through, even before we expand to other geographies, because that does require a lot of political and financial follow-through. And to conclude on the final point, what's very much this theme of pretty much every panel these days, the securitization of trade, value chains, and in particular clean energy technologies and critical minerals related to the climate transition. To make a long story short, I think there is a big opportunity for a country in the region beyond China to enter into a very different type of a conversation with both Europe and the US compared to the ones they've had before. And I'm struck by the fact that, yes, both Europe and the US will try to de-risk the relationship with China, and I think in its most basic sense it's going to mean a diversification of value chains. And I think countries in the region outside of China have a huge opportunity to do that in partnership with the EU and the US. The only thing is that both Europe and the US need to realize, I think, that they're in competition with China. And that this is what happened with the IRA and in many ways in Europe as well with the industrial and securitization policy. But I'm struck by the fact that it started at least 10 years before in China, because I would date it pretty clearly to at least 2010. But the point is that there are loads of countries in the region that should enter into not free trade agreements with Europe and the US, but strategic trade and investment agreements that also build the green refining, but manufacturing capacity in those countries. And for me, and I'll stop here, I think it's going to be a new fast-growing business line for finance institutions like the IFC and others to really be in support of the green manufacturing industry in middle-income countries in Southeast Asia and other places.
Well, thank you so much, Emmanuel, for that extremely rich introductory segment. I think there's a lot to unpack there. And I'd like to give Vivek a chance to weigh in with his thoughts, which I'm sure are just as rich and probably quite complementary in terms of adding a different perspective. So take it away, Vivek, and then we'll dive in.
Well, thanks very much, Kate, and thank you very much, Serge, for hosting us, and Emmanuel. Pleasure to be sitting by your side. Let's just go back into history a little bit. The COP in Paris was largely a COP with the public sector here. It was largely a COP where there was an advocacy for climate, and it was largely led by the governments. The COP turned to 5 years down the road. The COP in Glasgow was completely, I would argue, dominated by the private sector. I mean, that's why Mark Carney announced GFANS and, So, we're really good at saying we're not doing a great job, but just look at the movement in 5 years from completely public sector to, I would say, dominated by the private sector. Let me very quickly also add the private sector has to do a lot more. I mean, let's be very clear on that, and we are in that role and we're doing that. Yeah. So that's the movement we've had. Now, how do we take it to the next level? I'll just talk a little bit, and it's no coincidence that we just had our all climate meetings last year, when the whole area of Paris alignment, which is what we've embarked on. So that's a big movement for the MDBs, and we've all embarked that we will adhere to the principles of the Paris Agreement, which was made in 2016. Yeah. Let's just go to Asia. I think, so, Emmanuel, you talked about the JETPs. I think the key word in there is the J, I would say, the just part. I'll give you an example. When we launched our report in India, this came up. India is largely dominated by coal. It's a country I come from. Indonesia is largely dominated by coal. It's just not the energy sector. Coal is dominant in all aspects of society. My numbers may be a bit off, but about 40% of the workforce in coal in India is unofficial. So we have to be very careful on when we're talking about, we may solve the energy challenge or the energy transition, but you're going to have a social problem on your hands. We have to start creating jobs today for those people who lose jobs that are associated with coal. And like I said, in India, I think it's about 40% in the informal sector, so they don't exist on paper. So we have to start skilling those people so they'll get jobs. I am personally a big believer that new jobs will be created. Just like when digitization started, everyone said, a lot of these jobs are going to disappear. But if you look at unemployment globally today, it's at an all-time low. So I'm a big believer that the new economy or the decarbonized economy will create new jobs. But collectively, we need to be working with governments to ensure that people can get skilled for that. So I just thought I'd touch upon that. The second really important point, I think, is we cannot divorce ourselves from the political economy. Coal in India, Indonesia, South Africa are key to, these are all vibrant democracies. There's a large vote bank there, there's a huge amount of vested interests, and we cannot just wish them away. They exist, whether we like it or not. And I think what we're finding very often is, we're going to do this. But, there are countries where these are vote banks. There are countries where the unions from coal are playing a big role in getting people elected to office. Some of these are unfortunately illegal mafias that dominate the political environment in those particular parts of the country. So I think the political economy, when we look at any transition, is going to be critical. And in Asia, Europe, wherever it is, I think, yeah. I just wanted to touch upon, I think Asia is going to be critical. Like I keep saying, the battle for carbon is going to be fought in Asia. And it's very simple. Asia is the manufacturing hub globally. So I also think it's a bit unfair to Asia to say Asia needs to cut down its emissions, because if this phone was made somewhere else and I'm buying it in the US or in France, I cannot tell Asia to cut its emissions made on this phone. So we can't say we're going to outsource manufacturing, and especially what I would call the dirty manufacturing or the more carbon efficient manufacturing to another part of the world and tell them you fix the problem. I mean, that's just not going to happen. Now, there's a price to pay. I can produce anything which is decarbonized, but someone has to pay for that. And I think that is really the crux of the problem that we're facing today. It's easy to, I'm talking to a company in Asia, they have a huge plant in Europe. They say, we can produce decarbonized steel, but it's going to cost me X dollars a ton more. Who's going to pay for that? So there are solutions to decarbonization. So I think we need to understand that there is a price to pay. So I can, the same suit I'm wearing today can be produced with much lower carbon footprint, but who's going to pay for that? Am I willing to pay for that? And I think that's why it's contingent on, everyone, unfortunately, in climate says it's someone else's problem. No, it's all our problems. So I think Asia, the opportunities are very clear. Growth rates in Asia, notwithstanding a few years, are going to be pretty high. I think they're amongst the highest in the world if you look at it collectively. And any economic activity, as I keep saying, is going to have carbon emissions. So we can't wish that away. Even the phone calls we make, or every time on the internet, is going through a data center which has a huge carbon footprint there. So I think the opportunity is clear in Asia. The challenges are, I think, and it's very hard, and I'm not a big believer in saying challenges across the sector. We have to really break it down into bite-sized chunks. And this is what, I just came from another panel and it got a bit difficult there. But I said, I don't want to look at energy transition. I want to look at hard-to-abate sectors. Hard-to-abate sectors totally will contribute at least 30% of global emissions: steel, cement, fertilizers, other chemicals, at least 35%. We cannot ignore them. And I think a big part of the economy that we're all forgetting is the SMEs, the small and medium enterprises. They are 60% of an economy. In some countries, they're 70, 80%. Who is going to decarbonize them? And if we don't decarbonize them, there's no way we're going to get to 1.5 degrees. And if you don't decarbonize them, they're not going to be part of some of these indirect or direct global value chains that exist. So I think we have to really start breaking it up into these different segments. Two more points, and then we'll get to the next part. One is, I think we are forgetting there's a huge pool of capital in each one of these countries in emerging markets that is not going into climate. You know, ironically, and I hope I'm not wrong on this, as I come from India, so I can say it. The Canadian pensioners have put more into renewable energy in India than Indian pension funds. So my question because I know, I'm from an MDB, I'm from the World Bank Group. We're getting used to getting beaten up in every public forum. It's everybody. MDBs are the solution. So yes, we are going to be there. And we are doing hell of a lot. This year in IFC, we're going to be at about 45% of all our commitments have gone towards climate this year. June 30th, I hope at least we'll be around that number. So we're doing a fair amount. We need to do more. But everybody has to play their role. What are the local banks doing? What are the local funds doing? What are the local pensioners doing? So I think we need to come up with how do we connect domestic savings, as I would like to say, into climate at a local level. And the reason I say that's critical is, unfortunately, I've lived through 3 or 4 currency crises in my lifetime, in my working lifetime. I've seen the Thai baht go from 25 to 57 in a matter of 6 months. I've seen the Egyptian pound go from 3.85 to 34.5 this year. So if we're going to continue to rely on global capital to finance climate, I think we're going to have a currency problem. And interestingly enough, a lot of these countries that have been borrowing to finance the transition, today their central banks have to say, we don't have the dollars anymore. We're facing that problem. And the amount of issues we're facing in currency risk today is unprecedented, which is why I keep coming back to we need to mobilize domestic capital to come into climate. And if there's one thing I'm a big believer in, I think collectively all of us, and I mean all of us, MDBs, private sector, philanthropy, governments, maybe we need a pool of capital for currency risk itself, because that's a major factor which is stopping capital from flowing in. The last thing I want to say is that the risk perception, I think, is a bit unfair again. When you say emerging markets, it's all painted with everything is high risk. Well, I wish someone did the math and said the default of PPAs in Spain, I think, was higher than many emerging markets today. So I think, again, I'm a big believer. Let's say country by country. I hate hearing it. Emerging markets are highly risky, yes. But let's go sector by sector. Is investing in cement in Vietnam riskier than investing in cement in Canada? I don't know. But let's do that analysis to say it is when you don't have cross-border flows of capital. So I think, we have to start taking this risk country by country, sector by sector, and then seeing what is needed to de-risk. And one of the things that we have seen, which is factual, I think, is a lot of investors, especially institutional investors, do not want to take construction risk. They're not used to that. They don't want to take it. They don't want to take early stage operating risk. So we've done that. We've set up platforms. So we are hoping to come up with now another idea that we've had is warehousing. Can we come up with a structure where you take all the early stage construction risks, pull it in, warehouse it? Once construction and early stage operation are over, you've de-risked it, then you can hopefully have a platform of diversified assets where we can then get in global capital. We've done that, I would argue, very successfully. We've got a platform called MCPP. We just launched MCPP One Planet in COP in Glasgow, which is slightly less than 2 years ago. And we've already raised, I think, close to $3 billion for that. And that's a platform where sovereign wealth funds, private sector come in, and we offer them a diversified pool of assets, and we partially de-risk it. We've also launched 2 green bond funds, one with Amundi, and we're celebrating 5 years of that tomorrow. That's again an example, and then one with HSBC called Regio, and we've just closing on our 3rd one, I hope, very soon. So these are things that we are doing to crowd in private capital. But I always question, so we've had one example of each, if MCPP is a loan platform. It's over 11 billion, almost 12 billion. I mean, we probably need to take it to 40 billion or 50 billion. I'll close by saying that one of the key challenges that we're going to face in this climate transition is the word transition. We keep forgetting it's a transition, and therefore I think it's going to be a journey. I think it's not going to happen overnight, and everyone has to be patient as long as we're pulling in the right direction. I think we'll get there, which is why I'm in this business. And the last thing I'll say is that I'm a big believer in everything we do, or most of what we do, has to be commercially viable. Renewable energy was not commercially viable 20 years ago. We've done deals at 28 cents, many of which defaulted and we've lost money. But today at 2.5, 3, 5 cents, I think renewable energy is a lot more viable there.
Thanks so much, Vivek. I think that was a really helpful reality check and sort of grounding in some of the specific perspectives that you bring to the table. I want to give Emmanuel a chance first to see if you want to respond to any of Vivek's opening, and then I might bring it back to the broader work of the Commission and sort of how that fits into the summit.
Maybe very simply to highlight two of the last points that Vivek made because they resonated a lot with me, and I think they would very usefully become a shared priority. The first is on the idea we would need to get a bit creative, but I completely agree with you that it'd be a good use of public money and efforts to try and pull currency risks and address it, because I am, like you, frightened about how it's going in so many countries. But the reason it resonated so strongly with me is also because going to your country quite often, the currency risk has always been the number one issue brought to my attention by Indian renewable energy developers and financiers, because that was the biggest cost they had to insure against, and that was the single most important reason why renewable energy projects didn't get financed in India. So, which brings me to the second point. I was very interested to hear you say about some of the specific platforms that you're creating. Is essentially, if I understood you well, to have the Bretton Woods system, let's call it like this, at large, get back seriously into the business of financing infrastructure by creating the condition for the construction risks to be taken care of if pension funds and banks and others don't want to go big time into this. But this is where I think it's critical that we get it right and get it right quickly. So that was very good to hear you mention those two specific things at the end, I thought.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Vivek, I don't know if you want to respond to any of that.
Well, I think we're in agreement on most things. So, I mean, I'll just touch upon what Emmanuel said about loss and damage. So I was in a panel for climate justice, and the whole panel was talking about, yes, we need to get what I would broadly say is the global north to finance some of it, and yes, there is some truth. But I turned around and said, when you look at that photograph behind y'all, or there, is if you don't solve the climate problem, you're really, country by country, flooding, you can take, you can make your assets resilient to some of these climate risks. So that's part of what we're doing under the Paris Agreement is every project that we finance, we're going to be working to see how that particular, whether it's a power plant or a road or an airport or a hotel or factory, how is it made resilient to climate risk? So I think countries also need to move away from somebody else did the damage, you pay for it, all that. I think those parallel tracks should happen. But at least I think what countries can do going forward, they can mitigate against a lot of these risks. You can make your assets resilient to climate risk. And the last thing I'll say is in climate justice, when it comes to that, or a just transition, I think, is the fact that if you're going to be having to breathe polluting, dirty air, as living in Washington, I think 2 weeks ago, We had the forest fires from Canada coming down. I'm moving to Singapore soon, and we used to have the forest fires from the slash and burn from Indonesia coming in, which have been sorted out now. But I would hate to know what a young child growing up in any of these countries where there's a lot of pollution, what their lungs look like, and what is their future in terms of an unhealthy future. And I think we need to also frame it in that in mind, because it's not only just about broadly saying it's a better future for our children and grandchildren. It's been proven. I mean, lung disease in a lot of these countries, or particularly in cities, is much worse than many others. And I think the cost, just from a cost perspective, to then pay for the medical care when we have a problem is going to be a lot more than sorting the problem out today.
Yeah, that certainly rings hollow as someone I myself used to live in Beijing and then moved to DC thinking I'd be breathing cleaner air. But certainly if we go the direction we're going, we have a lot of work to do before we can guarantee that future, which is scary to think about, but also a lot of opportunity here. So going back to the research I mentioned, the commission, our most recent report, Getting Asia Net Zero, essentially looked at modeling if the Asia Pacific region were to hit net zero by 2050. And it found that this would actually add as much as above 6% to GDP at peak, and create as many as over 36 million jobs above the baseline under a business as usual scenario. So this idea that economic growth and addressing climate change are at odds is not necessarily a true narrative, but at the same time, obviously the finance being the biggest barrier, the report found about 70 trillion would be needed investment across the region in order to hit that target. So I want to go back to this idea of the just element, because a key part of this is what does that transition look like for the fossil fuel workers that will be displaced? Obviously, the political economy is a huge issue there, how that relates to actually creating a political system that incentivizes industries outside of the fossil fuel system and transition away from the dependency on the centrality of those industries to a lot of the economies in the region. We talk about also with the current focus of COP28 being led by fossil fuels economies, you can't just address the emissions from fossil fuels. You have to figure out a way to actually phase out the fossil fuels themselves while providing the transitionary mechanisms for that. So bringing it back to the summit as well, I want to ask sort of against that backdrop, and then also this idea of the Just Energy Transition Partnerships being a model that's been put forth, but we haven't proven that model yet, and some of the other elements that have been mentioned. If you were to pick one or two concrete outcomes from this summit in that context or against that backdrop that you think would best address sort of the priorities of some of the economies in Asia that we've been addressing, what do you think that would be? Or what do you think is perhaps even at danger of being sort of put to the side of the summit at risk of not addressing the needs of the Asian region, if that makes sense?
Well, I think Vivek started to allude to this, but I think there are some discussions that can take place in a foreign capital during a summit, but a lot of it is in fact deeply ingrained into local politics and local economy and the retraining of workers, in particular with the additional challenges associated to the fact that many of them, in fact, and not just in India, but other places, aren't in the informal sector. I agree for having been involved into some of those deals that ironically, frankly, the J part of the acronym is the most difficult to raise money for. I mean, this is what was left behind in the case of the South Africa deal, for example. And this is also where, the philanthropic money that can go into those deals is too small compared to the size of what needs to be funded on the just energy part of the energy transition, and where we need, I think, also some serious public money to back it up. I also think, and I think it's going to be an issue given the participation to the summit that it's important to be laser focused on delivery once they're done. It's important to be laser focused as well on the local politics to make sure that we're not losing people's support for the energy transition, because otherwise that's what's happening. There is another side to this equation that I saw a bit when I was still in government and we negotiated the deal with BlackRock that was announced at the first One Planet Summit. Well, progressively you need the private sector and the private asset managers to lower the demands they have to organizations like the IFC and others about the type of public guarantees that they need to invest into things that frankly sometimes are plain vanilla in plain vanilla countries. And at the moment they're insisted on very serious and expensive guarantees to do renewable energy in middle income countries. And as you said, I think the perception of the risk is wrong in both cases. So I'm hoping also that as we build a pipeline of just energy transition partnerships in many different geographies. I mean, this is where it needs to spread fast, much beyond the 3 countries in Asia to cover way more, and the same in Africa after South Africa and Senegal and Egypt, etc. But I think somebody needs to have a view that what we're trying to get after each and every deal is the private sector asking less guarantees and chipping in for more, because this is how we going to get serious about the sums of money that need to be invested in the energy transition in the middle income countries of Asia and elsewhere.
Vivek?
So I think, I touched upon it earlier on the importance of skilling. So I was actually looking for this quote, which I used to use many years ago on the digital economy. It's by John F. Kennedy. So it's 50 years, 60 years old now. It says, if men have the talent to invent new machines that put men out of work, they have the talent to put those men back into work. So I think, innovation, automation, digitization has been going on now for decades. And we have managed to put collectively people back into work. But it doesn't happen by accident. I believe it has to be an effort where we have to say, okay, if green buildings, I'm just taking an example, if green buildings are going to be very big going forward, do we have the skill set for inspectors who go and inspect these buildings to have the credentials so that they can assess how green a building is? And that's a big area of work for us. So I'm giving just one example. You're going to need a different skill set for running a solar plant. Or you're going to need, and most of these skills, that the good news is it's about upskilling, which in any case we should be doing across the world. You need to be upskilling all the time if you want to stay ahead. So, when you see the use of technology is going to increase dramatically, I think, when you talk about energy consumption and the way we manage energy and automation, these things are going to be huge going forward. So I think making sure that the youth of tomorrow are skilled for that is going to be critical. So that's clearly one thing I think that's going to be important. The second thing is I think we need to be quite clear on the fact that, so everyone is talking about phasing down coal, which I agree with. I think we need to equally focus on driving down the cost of renewables. If I had a pot of money today, I would honestly use it to drive down the cost of renewables even more so that eventually coal itself becomes unviable. Now, that doesn't mean we will not have to shut down coal plants. Eventually, we will. But if you go to India or Indonesia or South Africa today and say, we're going to shut coal down, I mean, chances are if I went to a lower income or neighborhood, I'll probably get beaten up because those people don't have energy today. And then you're going to tell them we're going to shut down coal. I just don't think it's practical. I think we need to really ramp up the renewable energy resources in these countries around the world and drive down the costs in a way that it continues to be affordable. And let's not forget that renewable energy on its own cannot cut it. You still need thermal or hydro for peak load and base load, basically. So the way it's happening today is either you have battery technologies or storage batteries to support it, but that puts the cost significantly higher. Or you have to have a backup plant which is probably fossil fuels, either gas or coal, or if it's hydro, great. Not all countries have hydro. But then the cost of that plant lying idle for X number of hours a day is also huge. So, we have to do the math, and that's why I'm a big believer in doing the math country by country, sector by sector, and see what's needed. But I just hope that we can use some amount of philanthropic capital, especially in some of the smaller countries where they don't have the scale, to get investments and to, the economies of scale which you can get in an India or a China or a Philippines or Vietnam or Indonesia. Not every country has that. So doing a solar plant, I think in India, the last auction we did it was less than 3 cents. Going to a small country in the Pacific, it's probably going to be 5 times that or 4 times that. So we really need to drive down costs and use philanthropic capital or blended finance, or we can call it, whatever we want, but we need a pot of money to drive down the cost of renewables dramatically, I think.
Makes a lot of sense. I want to ask one more question and then open it up to audience in case anyone has questions they want to ask our speakers. But before that, I want to touch quickly on the idea of what's next from a political perspective, and most especially with India hosting the G20 this year. So as most of you are probably aware, President Modi is with Biden right now in the States, but will be coming to France next month to visit with President Macron. There's a huge opportunity here to sort of take the outcomes of this summit and sort of broaden them out and bring them back to the India G20 presidency and build on them going forward, especially building off of some of the focus of the Indonesia G20 presidency last year. So I want to ask our speakers from the political momentum perspective, what do you think the India G20 presidency can and should be doing on the back of this summit to build that momentum going forward?
It's hard for me to say what my prime minister should be doing when he is in the US. I think, one is India is a great example, and I'll start with the positive, of how they've managed to get. I think India has 67 gigawatts of renewable energy today, which is far below where it needs to be. One can argue, but if you look at it, and it's important to see how India did it, and I hope they can go and talk about that, because India did not do this energy, the renewable energy was not done with the large energy companies. It wasn't done with global capital. It was actually done by relatively small companies. The first company we financed, Azure Power, eventually got listed in the New York Stock Exchange. But it was literally one guy who came back to India from the US in the Pre-Vatpa and said, this is what I want to do. And then you had a little bit of, Renew Power set up with Goldman Sachs. That's probably the only company initially. So it's interesting to see how that happened. And I think talking about that is important. And that's a great example of how once you've got scale and you made people comfortable with the sector and at least partially de-risked it, then you've had global capital coming in. And today India is attracting a lot of global capital in the energy space. So I think the other thing is really, I think what's seriously needed is, I know everyone's talking about the climate financing needs, but I think we cannot ignore the hard-to-abate sectors, steel, cement, like I said earlier. And I think the solutions are, we need to come up with at least a pathway to get there. Because without that, I think the 1.5 degrees is not going to happen. And I think that's an area I think India is focused on. I think they have the next G20 meeting in Goa with the CEM, I forget.
Clean Energy Ministry.
Yeah, the Clean Energy Ministry. There's so many acronyms today. I'm hoping that they will focus on that. And the third area, I think, like I said earlier, and I won't be repetitive, is SMEs. I mean, to me, these are going to be 3 critical areas to focus on going forward. Yeah. And I'm not saying climate risk and all those are equally important, but these will be my 3 first areas to look at.
I'm actually going to take moderator's privilege, ask one quick follow-up question on that. With the hard-to-abate sectors, one of the challenges is also the idea of stranded assets with infrastructure, especially with steel making with blast furnaces. Are there financial mechanisms that are particularly innovative or have a lot of potential to help with that issue that you're aware of?
Well, I'll say something about that then. On the summit first, and where it's going to go from there, I am not sure what the other Emmanuel Macron is going to be doing. What I know for sure, because I know sometimes initiatives that he takes on foreign policy can be a bit flamboyant and not always following through. On that one, frankly, there's been a lot of consistency in the very thorough engagement by the French system at large. I think we're going to see France to continue pushing on those issues, and very much with the view, as I said at the beginning, to bridge the global north and the global south. Some of you will know this, but President Macron has asked, he's not yet been responded to, but if he could be invited to the BRICS summit, because that's where he wants to go. The idea came up to his mind after Zelensky's visit to the Arab League summit. It shows you that I think, also going from India as a president of the G20 to Brazil next year. And I think it's very important because it's Dilma Rousseff who is the new chair of the BRICS New Development Bank in Shanghai. And it's an important player in the conversation we just had. I think you're going to see both the president and the Treasury and the Foreign Affairs Ministry more generally to continue and try to deliver some things that help us in this agenda. On the hard-to-abate sectors, I mean, the only thing I know for sure is how difficult of a conversation that is at the moment with the COP28 presidency and Dr. Sultan Al Jaber, the CEO of the National Oil and Gas Company in particular, because a bit ironically, the hard-to-abate sectors that are included into the initiative for COP28 at the moment include indeed things that are hard to abate, like cement and steel and aluminum, but a bit ironically, none of the sectors that are hard to abate but also consume oil, like chemicals and aviation and maritime. So I know that this is a fight at the moment, but I don't know how that will unfold before the end of the year.
Great. Well, I think at this point, I'm happy to open it up to audience question and answer if anybody has questions that you'd like to ask our speakers. And I think we have a mic next to Emmanuel. I don't know if we're able to sort of pass it around if somebody has a question.
I'd just like to thank both the speakers and our moderator on their insightful comments. I mean, obviously it's a thorny topic, but it strikes me that there's a lot of work being done on the production side. How do we lower the cost of renewable energy? How do we impose costs on transport, et cetera? But I see a lot less emphasis on the demand side. What work and what policy work and what money is flowing towards getting people to make lower carbon choices, given that at the moment at least they are more expensive? Because I mean, from a very simplistic perspective, if the West insisted on buying low carbon products, the demand would flow through and that would be easier to finance. I mean, I know there's niggles around first loss capital and construction risk and all those sorts of things, but if there was a wave of demand, then you think that would be extremely beneficial towards getting closer to the solution. So I'm just interested from you guys to hear what work is being done, as I said, more on the demand side than on what I would call the production side. Thank you.
I think it's a very good question because I share your diagnosis, at least, that this is the current status quo. There are different pockets of responses to your question. I mean, first, there is what I think a large number of countries now are doing around the circular economy type of agenda. And it does come with some policy tools to do this. They're not always easy to implement or carefully design, and that almost always requires something more than policy to top it up with. That has to do with, I think it's at the heart of the communication business as well. It was interesting, by the way, when we did, and my boss was the co-chair of that, the French national debate on the energy transition, and then the French Citizens' Assembly on climate. One of the very few policy measures that built a consensus among the 150 people was to really target the marketing industry, because this is where we have a problem in terms of the message that is being sent. So you see, it's already something quite different. There are loads of hurdles also in terms of economic power on the two sides of the equation to make it happen. And I think it's one of the reasons why the agenda so far has been focusing mainly on the supply side and much less so on the demand side. I mean, you need to organize the people on the demand side, whereas the people on the supply side are organized. Very quickly, they see it as a threat when you develop an alternative, lower carbon products than theirs. So that's why there was a big effort in Europe and other places to build renewable energy trade unions to be able to negotiate in front of the others. So there are tons of stuff happening in different types of places, but I think you're right that we're going to see more and more of the demand agenda, I think, coming closer to the center of the debate. And I happen to think that this is where the biggest disruptions to the system are going to come from. So, absolutely.
So I think there are two parts to it. So one is, I would say, our own personal choices that we make. So, I always raise this question when I'm talking to students who want a career in climate, say, that the next time you're going out to buy a shirt or a glass, I would love to be given two options. This is a glass made with high emissions. It costs whatever, €1. And this is a glass made with low emissions, and it costs €1.25. So because there is a cost to it at the end of the day, I think we have to be prepared for that. So that's one part of it where we need to do a lot more education. Unfortunately, the whole climate agenda, unfortunately, is more going towards disasters, but not the solutions. I haven't read a single article I'm not singling out the FT, but that's a paper I love and I read it every day, talking about the opportunities in climate or what can each one of us do. Yes, we can all go and protest, but are we willing to make personal choices that will lead to the change in disruption that you're talking about? That's one way. The second part is, I think, the carbon border mechanism, which the EU has adopted, where you are going to tax anything with higher emissions. Now, that has its benefits, but we also need to make sure that there is a transition, because you can't have certain parts of the value chain then completely cut off, because you're going to, again, like I say, you may solve the climate problem in one part of the world, but you'll have a social problem. So if Bangladesh, for example, which is very big into garment exports, if we can't collectively help them decarbonize their value chain in ready-made garments, they may not be able to export into the EU, or there'll be higher cost to it, and then someone has to pay for it. So I think it has to be both the government and at the policy level, and it has to be a transition. I don't think it should be from day one, you to just start something. We'll give you time, as long as you're moving in the right direction. And the second part is, like I said, personal choices that we make.
Mm-hmm. I would just add to that quickly. It's interesting to see that one of the other focuses of the India G20 presidency is on this initiative LIFE, L-I-F-E, which is essentially Modi's push for low carbon environmental lifestyles. But a big element of that as well is what happens with the per capita emissions in the developed world being so much higher, because you need to bring those down. But obviously, if we can keep per capita emissions from reaching the levels that they have in countries like the United States, globally, as we continue to develop, that's a huge avoided emissions bomb. But interesting to see that prioritized from a political perspective.
One small thing which I love making a point on is I really don't think we should be wearing suits and ties in this weather. So for all the gentlemen and ladies who are wearing short sleeves, yeah, but just put the air conditioning 4 degrees higher and you're going to save a lot of energy. I mean, I actually mean it. But these are little things that we can do which will have an impact. But somebody has to start doing it.